Welcome and good morning. I am delighted to share what I have learned in my study entitled, What is Prayer? The Christian, Agnostic, and Atheist Perspectives. Prayer is essential in the lives of people of many faiths, and particularly so in the lives of Christians who have been talking to God for over 2,000 years. I have become increasingly interested in prayer, in the prayer lives of congregations as part of my supervised field education placements, where I had opportunities to pray with them, for them, and to lead them in prayer. I have led 2 prayer workshops. Those who participated had the opportunity to pray the labyrinth out in community at a Shambhala center. And this was followed by another opportunity to pray for their neighbors and organizations in a prayer pilgrimage by vehicle. And this was an exercise in preparing to discern new engagement in mission and in ministry in the wider community as it eased out of COVID pandemic health and safety restrictions. These experiences lead me to ponder how prayer would be received by people in the community, non-Christians, agnostics, and atheists specifically, and whether people who self-identify as being in these groups have habits or rituals or spiritual practices that might be considered prayer-like. I wondered what may be drawn from conversations about prayer and these groups that indicated what meaning prayer might have in their lives. It was interesting to research prayer in this current post-colonial, socio-political, and religious context as a tapestry that keeps changing. This grounded theory study begins with 3 focus groups, each one consisting of 2 and one with 3 volunteer participants, self-identifying as either Christian, agnostic, or atheist. Focus group interviews were conducted separately to provide a safe space for revealed data that showed there is a wide spectrum of understanding of what prayer is and people's experiences of prayer, how it relates to who God is for them and their experiences in prayer, and also to their relationships with others. All groups were asked to describe words or terms for what they do or experience in prayer, or if the word prayer does not fit into their practice, what word or words do. They were asked about their understanding of prayer and their experiences of prayer, if they had any, whether this had changed, and about their curiosity about prayer or prayer-like practices, how prayer made them feel, and how they felt about praying for others and having others pray for them. I acknowledge my bias as a Christian who recognizes the importance of prayer for spiritual and physical health and well-being, as well as ensuring that all voices are heard and respected in these conversations. What is prayer for Christians? The names have been changed, and we hear from Allison, Brian, and Carol. Describing words have been daily, ongoing conversation with God, fluid communication, so many words and ways to pray. Prayer, talk to God whenever and wherever. Is movement, silent, subconscious. Praying in different directions, saying grace, blogging, thinking prayer, meditation. Prayer is a whole language, a common language that's used differently for people, different people. Very, very powerful, quietly walking a pilgrimage. dropping in intently, internally, to become centered, focused, and inner awareness through a connection with the Holy Spirit. One Christian spoke of how they describe prayer in conversation with a skeptic raised in the church. And they were saying, it is as if one is speaking to that inner part of myself, through which my deep desires or laments or intercessions, whatever they are, may be transmitted through them, thinking of Godhead, Jesus, Holy Spirit. Another described prayer as act, giving an example of intentionally thanking a washroom custodian in a mall one day, praising the work he did, and asking God to bless him in his work and life out loud. This view of prayer was surprising to one other Christian who thanked them for stretching their understanding of prayer. Experiences of prayer were described as private, but also communal, with one other person in a group setting and in church as congregations. Prayer is both personal and communal in nature, as people intentionally worship and communicate with God and with each other, talking about God with Christian family and friends as often as they meet, as Allison shared. Prayer is relational, never static, but always moving those who pray either closer or further away from God. This is a journey towards spiritual maturity. What is prayer for agnostics? Agnostic volunteers in the focus group had varying experiences of religion. One was raised Catholic and was allowed to decide about going to church or not at the age of 14. They have gone to church for funerals, one experience in particular not being positive emotionally. They were not able to connect with the people nor the liturgy. They stopped going to church. The other participant was not raised with religion or has any religious ties. However, occasionally attends Jewish temple or other religious services with their spouse who was raised Catholic but had a Jewish father. Both were very interested in participating in the study. Their names are also changed for confidentiality. One offered the comment, I'm also looking forward to this. This type of conversation is new to me. Finding words to describe prayer meant discerning through experience of prayer as a child on one hand, and sourcing other words for processing critical moments when one might pray or be tempted to pray. And these words and descriptions were offered. Hope. Hope does not fit with me. I understand its meaning. I understand its value to a lot of people. Maybe action. I think that hope and action would be the words I would use to describe prayer for me. Hope for me too, from Evan. Hope on its own isn't of much use to me. Hope and planning go together. Given a hypothetical scenario or crisis of a possible car crash where planning is not a variable, they were asked what hope might look like for them in that situation. Hope doesn't mean a whole lot to me. If it's outside my control, if that's what you are asking, I will hope for something, and then I will tell myself, whatever will be, will be. One shared, now, in extreme situations, can I say that I wouldn't turn to prayer? No, maybe, I don't know. The other commented, so there are times when you know when planning is no longer possible. So all you can do is hope. You can just hope that the airbags work or the seatbelts, or you know that the structure of the car protects you. In that flash of a second, Hope is all you have. When asked about what hope feels like, one participant shared an experience of prayer as hope. Several years ago, they were diagnosed with a benign brain tumor that was to be surgically removed. So they prepared for that day. They improved their physical shape, planning and doing all of the right things for the day of surgery. But on that day, they were hoping that the doctors and hospital staff were awake, got a good night's sleep or rest the night before, and that they were well trained, etc. What they added to the story, though, was prayer offered up on their behalf by their mother-in-law and her prayer group, who got up at 7 o'clock to pray on the day of the surgery. The participant, Evan, commented, "So even though I don't put a lot of stock in prayer per se, having these nice people send this positive energy my way made me feel a little bit better." The other participant shared a memory of reciting from a book that there are no emotional ties to prayer, even when she was given a picture of herself at age 6 or 7, kneeling in prayer. "I think my brain just wasn't developed enough to know whether or not it meant anything. I think for me, there's more external value for prayer." What is prayer for atheists? And who they are. Identity is something that showed up in my study as being important the more you tie your identity to who you are in the world. Atheist participants describe themselves as science-oriented, and both are highly educated. One, Fran, was not raised with religion, although they remember visiting a church once as a child. She identifies as non-theist. The other participant, George, was raised Catholic in a poor area, which competed with members of Protestant churches who were better off and had political clout. His father was Jewish and mother was from a Catholic family. He describes himself as more than just atheist, rather an anti-theist. A descriptor offered to begin conversation was, "The lack of theism is actually at the core of it, not a kind of specific belief in anything else." And the descriptors for prayer include reflection, maybe even a deeper level, maybe something like a long, deep reflection. In comparison to what Fran's friend who prays gets out of prayer, she finds a good definition would be contemplation or deep reflection. What George has to say about prayer resonates, however, as well, in terms of praying as an alternative to action that would solve issues. My perspective is, as soon as I hear the word prayer, I get a pushback. I view it as just a placebo for those who want to appear to be doing something and not really doing anything at all. Prayer makes me feel angry. It just brings back all kinds of connotations that are meaningless. In George's perspective, prayer has been destructive historically and points to thoughts and prayers sent all the time on Facebook or social media as a way of expressing platitudes, as George perceives them. It allows people to circumvent the issue at heart. When there's a mass shooting in the States, is the example he gives. At the heart of George's belief, in his words, we abdicate our thoughts to a supposed higher power. In this lies a powerless of prayer. If prayer is effective, then more Christians or Muslims or Jews would survive cancer or all the things that afflict us, expresses George which is really a lament towards the destruction and awful experiences of humans in the world. However, George experienced this. He also describes his practices with these words: sitting in secular meditation, just feeling, grounding myself. Grounding is the best word out there. Both were willing to speak of their personal experiences of prayer, despite these views. Fran views their version of contemplation or reflection as analogous to prayer, and will go off to think in times or situations that are challenging. Go for a walk to gain perspective. Sometimes she sits and thinks about their responsibilities to not only those she loves, but that of society and how she fits into the broader community. These moments help her recharge and refocus, and to help instill direction in her actions. Reflect on who she is in the world. George said of Fran's description of reflection that it certainly has a synergy for me. George has always been curious about faithful people. History has shaped his perspective in many ways, especially his family history. George's family came to Canada from extreme poverty in Europe after the destruction of World War II. There were no relatives left on the Jewish side of his family, and his mother's side had ties with the Nazis, with those participating in the destruction and extermination. George's mother was spiritual, agnostic, kind of covering all bases. These were dark times in history and for the Christian faith in Germany. George remembers, as a child, looking out of a car window, looking for God in the clouds and not finding God there. George was puzzled, as he really wanted to see that. One other anecdote was a time spent in his backyard rink while playing hockey. They were poor, and losing a hockey puck is a big deal for a kid. As a 9 or 10-year-old, he prayed to find the puck, but did not. Praying to a higher power was useless, like spitting in the wind. It didn't really matter. There wasn't anybody looking down and determining what I was going to do. And me appealing to that higher judgment was useless. Fran was not raised in a Christian household, and the subject of God or prayer, it just never came up, except for with her friends. And so she did see others pray. The idea of a personal relationship with a deity, or kind of like some being, never got a hold of me. I rationalized it as just trying to search for meaning. I heard about prayer through television and books. Now, out of the initial data from the focus groups, I identified some themes which are key and which directly have bearing on who chooses to pray and who chooses not to pray. These are vulnerability, who God is or isn't for people, stages of spiritual growth, and freedom to talk about prayer and learn how to pray with others, or in other words, sharing prayer. In each of the focus groups, every participant expressed in choice of words, in pauses, in speech, and facial expressions, a vulnerability they felt in sharing meaningful experiences and practices of prayer, or how doubt and disbelief became their pattern. They were vulnerable in sharing how much pain and hurt was experienced in search for God and not finding him in a world filled with destruction and pain. They were vulnerable in their stories of growing distant from God, stopping all connection with church in search of something different or nothing at all. and then finding their way back to God and church in relief and joy and affirmation. Relationship with God is mysterious, but having taken the time, braving, sharing the journey with others in community, in one-on-one or in groups, can help people become whole and spill out in life and relationships with others. Excuse me. He mentioned loss of family members. George, Alice, Brian, Diane, and Evan, 5 out of the 7. They expressed grief, uncertainty in their own health concerns and concerns over life and death. Carol, Brian, Alice, Evan. In their stories, we found cancer, tumors, and surgeries. Opening and sharing thoughts and feelings and experiences of prayer that transcended normal everyday life and prayer, and disappointments in prayer made up their stories. Who is God, or isn't God for you? In each of the focus groups, I was hearing definitions and ideas of what prayer is based on their experiences or non-experiences of prayer, which was converged in the agnostic and atheist groups. This meant the direct correlation to who they decided or experienced God to be determined about how open they were to receiving and offering prayer in the ways they perceived prayer. The less experience with prayer in their current stage of life, the more distant or impossible it was to accept that God exists, loves them, and desires close, intimate spiritual relationship with them. I noticed word choices for God, who is, in the atheist discussion, which included nobody looking down on, higher judgment, higher power, and useless, as well as never got a hold on me in reference to God. And this explores the idea of a power shift, taking back autonomy, which reflects one of George's initial comments about abdicating thoughts to a supposed higher power. This implies reliance on self in the powers of mind and body or action. I observed in conversation that the greater amount of emotional pain in the lives of individuals without relationships to God, the greater the anger in presuming that prayer has power and can heal or change their lives. It is hard to encounter a good God when so much is wrong in the world. But the inverse is true. The more Christians prayed, the greater their experience of God and trust through deeper relationship and experience of God, whether prayers were answered or not, in hoped-for ways. The more intimacy and love they associate with God is prayer, and permeates their whole lives and spills into relationships with others. Rowan Williams wrote, "In a nutshell, prayer is letting Jesus pray you, and beginning that lengthy and often very tough process by which our selfish thoughts and ideals and hopes are gradually aligned with his eternal action. Just as, in his own earthly life, his human fears and hopes and desires and emotions are put into the context of his love for the Father." Prayer is relational, and God invites us to grow into relationship with him over a lifetime of everyday encounters in prayer. Relationship with a holy God does not exactly mirror our relationship with earthly others, but there are patterns and processes that can be recognized by those who pray using various tools or practices. Now, one of the participants in the Christian group, Carol, identified her experience of prayer as that of a mystic. Her experiences of prayer often include movement, walking in conversation with another, or praying the rosary, using formal prayers by rote or read, to intentionally being open to where God would lead her, allowing her creativity and emotions to flow and lead her in times of prayer. She describes her experience of struggling with prayer and having worked on opening herself up to prayer from her heart and not solely from her head. Authentic prayer begins with an open heart, a key first step identified by theologian Karl Rahner. Her mystical experiences being open to encountering the Spirit in images has been a part of her journey through surgery and healing. Through a Jesus dream of light, walks during recovery, and in nature. She shared that in her dream, a pinpoint of light came down for me, and it illuminated first as a hare, then a deer, and then a man, in who she recognized as a Western image of Jesus. The moment that was most meaningful to her was when this man, Jesus, asked her, "So tell me, what do you have? Why do you have so much trouble with the resurrection?" This at a time when she was recovering from surgery. Answered prayers are not always from the questions that you ask consciously. In fact, all three participants have experienced meaningful prayer in more than word on journeys towards each of their own healing. Spiritual growth through prayer is unique to every person. And if we examine theory of cognitive and social learning as it has evolved in psychology, in particular in intergenerational Christian formation, bringing the whole church together in ministry, community, and worship, writers Alan Catterton and Lawton make specific reference to spiritual learning intergenerationally and in the theory developed by Lev Vygotsky, who came to believe that for persons to learn concepts, they must experience them and socially negotiate their meaning in authentic, complex learning environments. They go on to describe 3 zones of developmental activity, which include the zone of actual development, where people are actually in their development. The zone of potential development, where the learner potentially could or should be. And the zone of proximal development, where the amount of assistance required for a learner to move from the zone of actual development to zone of potential development happens. This boils down to when a person is ready to learn the next thing, or in the case of learning how to pray, the best way is to be with those who are ahead in the learning journey. The Christian focus group already underway, sharing their experiences of prayer, the power of prayer they encountered in their own lives and in the lives of others. Allison said, "I can talk about it all day. No, not everyone feels the same. And I sense when somebody wants to pray together, I do it." I noticed that even the agnostic and atheist focus groups individuals picked up on ideas and experiences that deepened their own understanding of their beliefs of what prayer is and isn't. And I noticed bonds deepening through conversation about prayer and experiences of prayer into concern for one another, as George expressed. I am not appealing to a higher power. So thank you, Fran, for putting that in as well. That has a synergy for me. It gives me whatever peace I can find. Who also says, "I am terrified for the future Fran faces, because looking at you, you look a lot younger than I do. You have so much of a future ahead of you regarding the trajectory of society." There's a freedom to talk about prayer with others. I began to hear about freedom to talk about prayer in an interview without broaching the topic of praying for others, and receiving this thought from a participant in terms of groups talking to one another about prayer. And while I find so many kind and caring religious people, it is an anathema to my way of thinking that you haven't stepped outside of that. You haven't learned as a position on prayer. Carol shared, I believe it is okay for other people, even when we don't have permission to do so. It is an act of faith. If we believe God is who we say God is, then we can do that without being wrong, without there being anything wrong in being exclusive or colonial. Focus groups learn from one another, taking new knowledge with them into their practices. I recently received an email from an agnostic participant responding to my invitation to join us today online. Evan replied regarding his participation. It was my absolute pleasure. I can't make the live stream, so I was about to say my usual thing, sending positive vibes. But I guess that's my version of praying for you. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus teaches the disciples how to pray and what to pray, and in analogies, the importance of persevering in prayer and asking God. For God is good and knows what each person needs. Finally, there is something all can ask themselves about the relationship between those who pray to God and each other, whoever they may be, and how much can be learned by meeting and listening to one another. The Christian three-in-one God has fluid communication, in Allison's words, which is understood as Trinity dancing in a perichoretic movement image. Can talking about prayer as sharing love and respect reflect this Trinitarian movement? Are those who profess to pray in their own ways and beliefs daring to risk in our everyday lives to enrich their own understanding and share? All three perspectives have much to share. Perhaps we as humans should take a deeper look at who teaches us to pray, or understand prayer and talk about prayer in all our relationships with each other as a means of our own change and growth. This has implications for further study. I want to thank you for listening and for hearing the words and voices of many. I would like to thank all of the volunteer participants for their trust and for their perspectives. And finally, I would also like to thank the many consultants and those who have offered support, Reverend Canon Dr. Jody Clark, the Reverend Dr. Dave Sinnes, the Dr. David Dean, Dr. Alida Faber, the Reverend Francis Drollett-Smith, and for all of you for listening. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you so much. Okay, we have time for conversation and prayer. Questions, comments, thoughts? I'm just going to throw this.
Can you folks hear me? Okay. Okay. Ruth, that was excellent. Thank you. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I like to think of the what ifs or imagine if one of your Christian group participants felt like George, someone who, but they engaged in explicitly theistic prayer, but they were disappointed or discouraged by the efficacy of prayer. I just, like to think that would be an interesting perspective to have had if that had happened to that Christian group. Yeah.
Actually, it did. I had so much data, it was very hard to pick and choose what to include. But there were people who were lifelong Christians, but found at a certain point in their life, in their young adult life, where they stepped away from going to church and stepped away from prayer simultaneously. They were engaged with other friends who had no faith per se, but who were engaged in other practices, spiritual practices, like tarot cards, Wicca, stones. And this person sought something else, but then came back to church. In my discernment of that part of the conversation, I did take note that they had been involved in very many things at church, and that that prospect of volunteer burnout was a piece of her journey.
Excellent. Thank you.
That was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Michael.
I wanted to find out, can you hear me? Okay, hello, can you hear me now? All right. I wanted to find out, considering the kind of society we are living in now, how far we can, as believers or Christians, talk with others about the need for prayer, or maybe even about our faith, because sometimes you see people that there's a kind of objection within the society. For instance, let me give an example. About 3 weeks ago, I was at Portland Hills Terminal, and these ladies, they walked in, they were from the Mormon church, because I know them. They wanted to share with somebody about their faith. And the woman got up, and she was so furious. Incidentally, I had spoken with the woman a week back while we were waiting at the bus stand. And she was so friendly, She told me she's in her 80s. Specifically, she said she was 85. The same lady, I was a bit taken aback. She stood up and was so aggressive towards the young ladies and said, you should not be talking about religion here. This is a public space, something like that. So I just want to find out, how far can we go within the constraint of the society, the Canadian society? It's a little different from where I'm coming from anyway. How far can we go to share our faith or our perspective about prayer or belief in our God? Thank you.
I may not have heard everything you said very clearly, but I will try to address that. To answer about the woman who stepped up and said that they shouldn't be sharing their faith or conversation that they were having, I think that happens a lot in our particular society in this time, where there is pushback from colonialism, and where religion has a big piece of that. But in observing some of my friends who are sitting here, that they have conversations with people just on a purely individual basis and build relationships, and they share who they are. And if they have a strong faith, that comes through, and they're not afraid to answer questions about faith, and not to be afraid to be curious about other people's perspectives. I hope that answers your question.
We have a question online from Reverend Morgan Bell, who is our visiting scholar right now. He says, Ruth, thank you for your excellent presentation, sensitive, thorough, well-conceived. You quote Rowan Williams, who envisions prayer as an intra-triune activity, God the Holy Spirit joining our own prayer to God the Son before God the Father. Prayer then is something that God does in or through us. How does this fit with your use of developmental models of spiritual growth, which can sometimes suggest a linear maturation on the part of the person who is praying? If prayer is an activity in which God enlists us, and thereby an act of grace, what does it mean to say that we develop or grow in prayer?
I'd like to answer that with a sort of an image that's in my mind. And the image is, and this could be in a church or not in church, where people are sitting together. They kind of know each other, but they don't necessarily know each other or know each other well. So I'm going to use the church example. You could have an individual sitting in a pew, and then a family plops in behind them, or a young teenager, and then they start a conversation. It could be related to something that was heard in the service, something that was prayed. And as that conversation develops, there is engagement in learning and engagement in sharing. And so in that proximal place, the person in that conversation, the individual who has been sitting there and has been sitting there for many decades, will have something to share with the individual who may be younger or who may be new to Christianity, and answer those questions. But they will also learn the perspective of the person who is new to Christianity or is just very young in their learning. I hope that answers the question.
Ruth, I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. So much to think about, particularly in terms of the mission edge. And I'm wondering if there's two sides to the coin. I'm wondering if you could say more. And I recognize this is a sampling in terms of the focus groups, particularly around the agnostics and the atheists. Is it a language issue around some of the God stuff is kind of the churchy stuff that's kind of a turnoff? And on the other side of that coin, if you think about the intersecting points, I wonder if there are could be environments for folks to explore or experiment around prayer-like practice that might be about mindfulness or spending time in intentional, quiet contemplation, meditation without the churchy language. So I'm wondering about those two sides. Is one a barrier around some of the God churchy language? And is the other, maybe there's an environment where there could be an intersecting point where folks could explore and experience the holy in an environment where they might try prayer in some form?
I believe that in anything we try, as we connect with people of different perspectives, that invitation is key to that. I can think of many examples that exist already or have been the direction that people have been moving in trying mindfulness, meditation, and contemplation. And I know it didn't really come clear in what I presented today, the larger discussion around what meditation and contemplation are in terms of describing it and the language for it in the atheist and agnostic groups. But there are intersections there. They may not see things the same way, but I think if we don't have the goal of trying to make people see things exactly the same as you do, and that would be true of all groups, that opens the door to understanding one another better. I hope that answers your question.
More questions?
Hey, Ruth, thank you for the presentation. This question is really, I want to make sure I'm not reading something into the data that's not there. So I notice that across the focus groups, there's some, and I think this makes sense, there's some interest in, let's say, control, or, in the Christian group, I'm giving something up to God, but in the atheist group, I don't, it's silly, I'm abdicating, and so I want to maintain control. I noticed that theme, and I wonder if I'm wrong in seeing that, though, because of the comments about prayer being maybe like deep contemplation, which might imply that it's not all about control, or maybe it is. So I'm just curious if I'm, misunderstanding or something.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up the word control, because especially in my conversations with agnostics and atheists, that control over the situations that happen in their lives is predominant. There is less willingness or no willingness at all to rely on somebody they don't see, somebody they don't feel or connect with. Relationship to God is exactly that, relational, but you have to have an open heart and a willingness to explore that. And this is just my opinion, that the more we build relationships with others and share what our experiences are, both good and not so good, that it will level the playing field, so to speak, where we are not seen as somebody who, or people who are trying to be, elevated towards God in prayer, but that we're actually people that live and breathe and eat and play and work on the ground just as they do. But we have found something that gives us meaning, and we access it through prayer.
Ruth, thank you. I remember when you first conceptualized this question, and everyone got really quite excited, as you all did today, about this possibility of a new kind of frontier. I mean, how many people here have had friends who are agnostic or atheists and said to you, oh God, right? I mean, just kind of in a flippant sort of way, or I have to contemplate that, I have to consider that. So we got everyone in the class that got really excited about this research question. You've certainly taken it, given it wings, given it life, explored it. The possibility of new kinds of relationships and new kinds of conversations are very much a product of what you came up with in your research. Ruth, thank you. Well done.
Thank you.